Hi there, everybody. It's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about plant nutrition. Now, the thing about plant nutrition is that if you're a small child and you ask, you're an adult, you ask a small child, what's the plant eating? The plant doesn't have any mouths, and so it's like the child would probably think, I don't know. That's a curious thing. It might be eating the soil. And so what's interesting about that is not even small child is thinking that. I think some adults are as well. And so some of the early ideas about plant nutrition, in other words, where they get their food, weren't exactly correct. And so, again, I don't need to poke fun, but sometimes it's in science, as you know, the incorrect that lead us to the correct. And so it's all good. Mistakes are welcome. And so going back to the Greek time, Aristotle thought that the plants were eating the soil, and so that wasn't exactly the case. And then fast forward several centuries to 1800s, a Dutch biologist, Van Helmont, did a really cool experiment when he was growing a willow tree, and he was putting it in a soil. And so check this out. I have a little video. We don't have actual video of Van Helmont in 1600.
Baptiste van Helmont
There he is.
conducted an experiment. In 1652, he wrote, "I took an earthen vessel in which I put 200 pounds of soil dried in an oven. Then I moistened it and pressed into it a shoot of willow weighing 5 pounds. After exactly 5 years, the tree that had grown weighed 169 pounds and about 3 ounces. But the vessel had never received anything but rainwater or distilled water. In the end, I dried the soil once more, weighed it, and got the same 200 pounds I started with, less about 2 ounces.
This experiment
Well, okay. So what do you make of that? Let's jump right into that conversation. So, pretty nifty experiment. I think if you were to read Helmont's journals, he might have come to the conclusion that the fact that this willow gained over the course of 5 years so much weight and the soil hadn't depreciated, the only explanation would be that the water that he was providing causes the increase in the plant weight. And so again, if you were to ask people on the street, why is a tree so heavy? Why is the redwood tree so heavy? I'm not sure people would try that. And interestingly enough is that von Helmont's conclusion that most of the weight came from water was not exactly correct. And so, though a plant is composed of a lot of water, only a small fraction of the water that travels through the plant is actually assimilated and contributes to the organic molecules that are in it. A lot of the water moves through. 90% of it just sort of goes in the root, goes up, and leaves through the leaf, through the guard cells, through transpiration. Although it's important because some of the water is used as a solvent and photosynthesis source of energy, and it also is important in maintaining turgor pressure. But the true answer to why the tree is so heavy, or why where's all that weight coming from? The answer is air. And so I don't know that anyone in the 1600s could have come up with that, but it's carbon dioxide. Trees are able to take in the carbon cycle CO2, so they're able to take invisible CO2 and assimilate it, fix it in the Calvin cycle. You might be familiar with that, and to produce not only sugars but all organic molecules, and that's the source of carbon. And so, as you can see here in this micrograph of plant cells, it's stained so that the cell walls, so a lot of the weight is coming from cell walls in a plant, a lot of the weight, particularly in wood where there's a lot of xylem, secondary cell walls as well. So that's where a lot of the weight is coming from, a lot of the bulk is coming from. And so plants are able to get that carbon and produce sugars through photosynthesis. They're able to produce oxygen, transpiration, losses of water, they breathe in oxygen here. But this conversation is about what the plant actually needs nutritionally. Other than sugar, we cannot survive ourselves on sugar alone. And so curiously enough, when I was sort of kidding around with how kids or people in the past used to think that the plants were eating soil, that's what our conversation is really about. They're getting essential elements, these minerals, from the soil. And so this is where they're getting their potassium and sodium and calcium and nitrates and phosphates. And again, they're picking that up in the roots with the help of the mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are these fungi hyphae that help to increase the surface area. So they're able to absorb all of these nutrients that they need to survive. And so these mineral nutrients are found in the soil. So they don't per se attribute a lot of weight to the plant, but that comes from carbon dioxide. But they do get, so they're vitamins, if you will, from these inorganic ions that are found in the soil. And so what are these? Well, one of the most important ones is nitrogen, as you may recall from another conversation about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrate is in the soil, and that's something that plants really take up, nitrogen. And so carbon dioxide, once again, comes in through the stomata, either in the upper or lower, mainly in the lower epidermis. Then it's incorporated through photosynthesis into sugars. And so the come away message is that the dry weight, 95% of the dry weight of is organic substances in plants, and the remaining is inorganic. So most of that organic matter is carbohydrate in cell walls. And so basically we're talking about, these are the critical elements. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen make up most of the weight. And so what is that? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And you're like, hey, look at that. Carbohydrate. So carbohydrates, in particular cellulose being a polysaccharide, is making up most of the dried weight. But there's also some critical other elements that we're going to be talking about. So nitrogen is very, very important. Obviously, plants need nitrogen from the soil in order to make amino acids, which are then converted into proteins. And they also need nitrogen to make the nitrogenous bases in nucleic acids, both RNA and DNA, and also adenine for ATP. They need to get sulfur from the soil as well. Sulfur is a crucial element in one of the amino acids. Phosphorus is a critical element from the soil. Plants need phosphorus for the 4 nitrogen bases of DNA and RNA. They also need it for adenosine triphosphate. They also need phosphorus for phospholipid bilayer of every cell membrane. So these are the critical elements right here that are most important. So my question to you is, how do we even know what plants need? You know, for example, here's some plants, and then here's a cutaway of the soil. So if they're getting all these chemical elements, if you think of the periodic table is about 100 elements, approximately. And botanists have been able to identify 50 different elements that are found in plants. And we're pretty confident that they don't need 50 different elements. And so we're like, what's up with that? Well, they're basically taking in whatever is reflected in the soil. So whatever inorganic substances are in plants kind of come from the soil, but not all of them are essential. So roots are able to take these things up somewhat selectively. However, what's interesting is the mineral composition of the plant sort of reflects the soil that it's growing in. And so the truth is some of these elements that are found in plants are just merely present, but they may not be essential. So how do we know what's essential? This is a good question. How do you go about solving that question? What are the essential nutrients that plants need to survive? In other words, you could tell that for a human. What are the essential vitamins? What are the essential minerals? What are the essential macromolecules that we need, and in what quantities? Some more than others, right? We eat food for bulk, but then we only need a small amount of vitamins. And so plant biologists have kind of come up with the fact that we need 9 macronutrients and at least 8 micronutrients. So about 17 compounds are essential for, but how do you know? It's like, well, one approach is, you see this spotness down below here? Sometimes plants, it's difficult to control soil. It's like you have to study it, you have to figure out like what's in it, what elements are in the soil, you have to break it apart, you have to analyze the quantity. It's very challenging. How about start with ordinary distilled water? You start off with distilled water and you're like, I'm going to grow plants through aquaculture. I'm going to grow, so you see the roots coming through here, and this is in a greenhouse, and this tray contains water. You're like, well, I don't think the plants are going to live very long just in water. They will not. But you can control it that way. Like, in other words, for a particular element to be essential, it needs to be there or else the plant will die. So check this out. In hydroponics, in other words, like if you were to culture or grow, that's what it means, plants in water, you can add whatever element you want and in whatever quantity. And then you can sort of subtract or add and sort of compare, like what are the consequences? What happens if I add a little bit of this and not so much of that? And you can see what are the effects to the plant, and you can sort of come to a conclusion which elements are critical and which ones are not as much. Pretty cool, huh? So here's a simple example of this. So instead of going on a massive greenhouse, you can go like just take an Erlenmeyer flask, and here's some water, and basically look at this one. Here's the control right here, and this is a plant that's growing and it's as healthy as can be. Look at the coloration of its leaves. Look how big they are. Look, it's flowering, and so this has all minerals. And so over here you could look at, here's an experimental one. There's a solution here, and it has everything that this one has in the control minus one particular element. In this case, it's minus potassium. And you're like, oh, so sad. Look at this. The leaves are yellowing. It's stunted growth, not only in height, but the leaf size is a little small. It's not flowering. It's in jeopardy. So one can then tease this apart and say, well, I wonder what potassium is doing. I wonder if potassium controls this, this, and this. So it's kind of interesting. We can look at what happens abnormally in appearance to plants to sort of determine what minerals are needed in what amounts. And so the minerals that are needed in large quantities, I mentioned before, are called macronutrients. And of course, those are our old buddies. If you recall this, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, your chomps. So here they are. So carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, your chomps. But then I want to add a couple of these other ones there. Potassium's really critical. Plants need potassium in the soil. They love that. They love their calcium. They love that, and they love their magnesium too. Right there. They need these elements as well as these elements to survive. Now, the other elements that they need that are essential. In other words, without them they wouldn't be able to survive, but they need them in smaller amounts. So there's 8 micronutrients that are rather critical. They need iron. We need iron. In our body we need iron for, if I were to ask you what's the most important thing for iron, you would say, ooh, I think iron is needed for the heme group and hemoglobin in my erythrocytes, my red blood cells, because that helps to carry oxygen. But I don't think plants have blood. Well, if you recall, iron is also part of the heme group in cytochromes, which are important electron carriers embedded in the electron transport chain in the mitochondria and chloroplasts. Woohoo! So plants need that as well. They need chlorine, they need copper, they need zinc, they need magnesium, they need molybdenum, that's cool, boron, and nickel. So they need these elements. You know, what's going on? Well, I don't know that we need to remember every single thing. You could look that up. You could see like what are these minerals doing and what happens. In other words, too much is bad, can become toxic, and then too little, there's deficiency. We could do the same thing with our own body. We could look up and say, how much vitamin C do we need? How much is too much? How much is too little? And what are the consequences of having too much and too little? All of this could be looked up on the internet. I don't think we should fill our head with this kind of facts, although curious as they are. I would just say in general, a lot of these micronutrients, some of these metals, are needed as cofactors for enzyme activity. Here's a picture of an enzyme. Just a small example. The fact that you may recall that one of the more critical enzymes in our body and in plants is an enzyme called DNA polymerase. And DNA polymerase is the enzyme that catalyzes the elongation of nucleotides during replication. DNA polymerase doesn't work without magnesium, so that's rather critical. Magnesium is needed as a cofactor. And also magnesium is needed, if you recall, and it makes up the structure of chlorophyll, or at least part of the structure of chlorophyll. And so that's rather important. And so here's an example of what I'm talking about. Like here's where iron is needed in a heme group that chloroplasts use in mitochondria in the electron transport chain. And so you could look at these micronutrients and see like what is weakened or what's going wrong. Here's an example of molybdenum deficiency. You're like, well, who are the scientists? Who are the people that are really interested in what these macronutrients and micronutrients? Who cares about all of these things? You can look all this up, and it's like, well, you know, for example, if you have a garden or if you're a farmer and your plants are looking a little yellowish like this, and you're concerned about it, maybe just because aesthetically the plants aren't growing, or maybe this is your business. It has what we call chlorosis, or yellowing of the leaf, and you're like, what's causing it? What's causing it? So you can bring it into the plant doctor. You know who knows all this? Gardening stores. You bring a plant in or describe it, take a picture with your digital camera or your iPhone. You bring that in. You're like, what's wrong with my plant? The gardener at the store is like the most knowledgeable person, especially when it comes to something practical. Well, clearly it's indicating that there's a magnesium deficiency because the soil probably is lacking magnesium, and therefore it's not able to make chlorophyll, and it's causing chlorosis. Although sometimes it's not as simple as that. Like maybe it's not magnesium. Maybe the soil is poor in iron. Oh, and iron was needed as a cofactor in a pathway that actually produces chlorophyll. And so therefore it's yellowing because it's lacking iron, and therefore it cannot use the magnesium properly to produce chlorophyll. So then now it's back to being complicated. So mineral deficiencies are often distinctive if you're a plant physiologist or a farmer or a gardener. You get pretty good at this. And it's not only the minerals that are critical in the soil for the plants to do well, but the pH has to be just right as well, because the pH will influence. Now when we talk about pH, you know it. We're talking about ions, hydrogen ion concentration, and that can influence whether or not the plant takes in other cations or other anions, and so that pH is critical in the soil. And so right out of the gate, you're like, well, there's so many elements, I cannot recall them all, I don't know. Well, let me just cut to the chase. Soil generally has lots of these minor elements in it. These are the elements right here. These are the ones. This is what we would like to remember. Plants really do well when there's nitrogen in the soil. When the soil is poor of nitrogen, plants are in jeopardy. So nitrogen's really critical in the soil. Nitrogen. Potassium is really important. Yes, potassium. And then phosphorus, very important in the soil. Now nitrogen isn't elemental like this. It could be nitrate, nitrite, or ammonia. So it's in a compound form. That's okay. That's fine. So these are the three biggies. So and you're like, this is all I need to know. And so most farmers are aware of this. And so you don't want to go crazy with it. In other words, like if you think you're going to just go to the store and buy this, and you can buy it, fertilizer, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. You don't want to overdo it. If you overdo it, it could be toxic to the plant. You can overdose. Then if you do too little, that's a problem. So you have to sort of balance it. It's really an experiment. It's how will I know? It's like you have to settle down. It's like cooking. How do you know how much? And you're like married to the recipe. It's like you've got to free yourself and be flexible. Like you need to react to your particular soil, to the particular plants that you're interested in growing, and you need to experiment. You need to try a little bit of this and then look at the consequences, take notes, take pictures, and then make adjustments. This is how we roll in science. You know that. And so one way to do this is like, well, I can't trust the soil. I don't know what's in it. I'm going to grow everything with hydroponics, like these strawberries, and then I'm going to know exactly what the strawberry needs, and then these tubes are going to provide just the right concentration of mineral elements. You could do that, and the plants would love you for it, but the thing is, it's kind of costly. It's expensive compared to growing it just in the soil. Just saying. And so that's all I wanted to say about that. So the thing is, mineral deficiencies are fairly rare in terms of terrestrial because there's a lot of minerals on the land. But let's not forget. I'll remind you that phytoplankton make up the majority of photosynthesis, with photosynthetic bacteria in the ocean. Planktonic algae, in other words, algae protists that are just floating around. This is where a lot of photosynthesis is taking place. And you're like, well, geez, I don't think the ocean has a lot of minerals. It has minerals, but the truth is not as much as the land. And so the ocean can actually have deficiencies. And so one of the deficiencies that we've seen is that iron can actually be a limiting reagent or limiting mineral, and then therefore affect plant growth in the water. And so what's fascinating about this is that scientists are experimenting because, they don't want to, this is kind of a risky experiment, but these are risky kind of times. Like one of the issues that concerns us these days is carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere, okay, as a result of combustion of fossil fuels mainly. And so humans are doing this. And so one of the ways to reduce carbon dioxide is that phytoplankton and algae are capable of doing this. And so let me just be silly and say that in the ocean we have these photosynthetic algae that can draw CO2 out. And it's like, well, there's not a lot of algae down here. And it's like, well, why not? Well, the water, I know it looks cold, but that seems to be the problem is that iron seems to be the limiting micronutrient in the ocean. And so scientists are studying, like, well, what happens if we add iron to the ocean? That would increase these algae blooms, and therefore that would draw out some of these greenhouse gases. Maybe it's a solution. Maybe there would be unanticipated environmental effects when we tinker with the ecosystem on such a profound level like this. Something to be considered. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation on plant nutrition. Thanks for watching.